Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible in part by a grant from the Inlay Foundation.
This is one of the largest swamps in the nation. Much of it remains unexplored and inaccessible. But we're about to show you some places that are spectacular. And if you like to paddle, 0kefenokee is paradise. This is the kind of place legends are made of. 700 miles of rugged wilderness with dramatic skies that loom above and water lilies so thick they could have been painted by Monet. Cypress trees rise from the black water like monuments to ancient gods. Trails of water twist and turn past hanging moss. Alligators watch silently, then without warning, there is a splash, and they are gone. 0kefenokee Swamp can change your life.
I'm a lifelong student of the swamp. You know, started bringing joy down here back when we were much younger. I'll never forget just how captivated she was. We got a boat and we were over on the west side of the swamp.
What went through my mind, and it sounds really strange, and the only way I can describe what I was feeling was, it was like, this is like being in a fairy tale. It was the most incredible thing I'd ever seen, and it just gets in your blood.
You know, at a time in my life when I wasn't exactly known for my good decisions, to be honest with you, we were running down this boat trail. She was sitting up in front of the boat, and her eyes were just shining, that big grin on her face, you know, and she was just, oh, this is beautiful, you know. That was one, it was kind of like, you know, this one's a keeper. I do not need to let her get away.
There are people, we have friends that are mountain people, we have friends that are beach people, but there's nothing like a swamp to me. We're swamp people.
Swamp people. Chip Campbell from Atlanta, Georgia, and his wife Joy from Brooklyn, New York, seem unlikely candidates. But they left high-tech jobs in North Carolina to begin sharing their love of this place with others.
They say, let's go, so we shall go.
Let's go.
Climb on aboard.
First year was really tough. I mean, we had moved from North Carolina. We had 3 months to sell our house, find a place to live, move down here, and get set up. Now, we knew the swamp, but it's getting a business all together because it's your own thing. We had to get boats and canoes and kayaks. It was really hard. And so the first year, you know, I joke, I tell people, we left our really good, secure, well-paying, well-benefited jobs in North Carolina to come and live in a swamp. And I joke, but it was a really good thing that we did. I mean, the first year, we never have looked back to say we shouldn't have done this. But the first year we kind of joked, it was like, what were we thinking?
This day they celebrate their anniversary with us. Married 25 years ago, Chip and Joy spent their honeymoon, where else? In the swamp. People have been drawn to 0kefenokee since the first Native Americans settled here as early as 2500 BC. At one time, this was part of the ocean floor, but gradually a huge sandbar cut this large basin off from the open sea. It developed into a tangled system of cypress forests, islands, lakes, and prairies. Like those out west, prairies in the swamp are wide open grassy territories, only here they are covered with shallow water. Life is just pumping out, and in minutes we spot sandhill cranes and alligators, more alligators. With Chip as our guide, the boat pushes through what until now we didn't recognize is a trail. These waterways are often thick with plant life.
Man, when the water gets low and you're trying to paddle, all of this muck here just makes it so hard.
A lot of that muck is made up of flesh-eating plants. Free-floating bladderwort has an innocent-looking flower, but their underwater leaves trap tiny aquatic creatures. Under those spotted hoods, pitcher plants capture and digest insects in long, deep wells. If it feels as if the swamp is sometimes closing in on you, it is.
Okay, I actually may not be able to get through here unless I get the weight moved up to the front of the boat.
The outline of the swamp looks a bit like the boundary of Georgia. There are at least 60 lakes and about 70 islands. The headwaters of two rivers rise from the midst of 0kefenokee, St. Mary's and Suwannee. You almost have to see it from the air to understand how large and untamed the 0kefenokee swamp really is. Retired Ranger Jim Burkhart spent 31 years of his life describing this vast beauty to visitors from across the world.
I mean, we have 438,000 acres of swamp out there. You're not seeing very much of it, even on 120 miles of boat trail. It's just huge portions of this refuge that are just inaccessible to anybody getting into them other than possibly an aircraft going over or something.
It is still a place where wilderness actually means wilderness.
You know, a lot of people come here and are scared to death that the alligators are going to get in the boat with them, and the snakes are just hanging in the trees waiting for them to come underneath. And that's the worst. That's the furthest thing from possibility of anything that's going to happen while they're here.
Even so, when the first people who ventured into the swamp met this welcoming committee, it must have been intimidating at best. Reports from Spanish explorers in the early 1500s reveal that at one time there were 3 Indian nations living in the swamp. The last Native Americans to call this home were the Seminole Indians. In 1838, General Charles Ronaldo Floyd battled the Seminoles, drove them south, and claimed the swamp for Georgia. But much of the language from those many tribes who lived here remains, like 0kefenokee. It means trembling earth. That's because the swamp really can move under your feet. Much of this ground is peat, which in simple terms is dead or dying vegetation. Even though peat floats on water, it can be at least 10 feet thick, enough to hold the weight of a man.
0kefenokee, like most of these big blackwater swamps along the southeast coastal plain, has formed since the end of the last ice age, which was about 10,000 years ago. So they're all pretty young. You know, you're kind of seeing a moment in geological time. You know, this will eventually be coal. This is where coal comes from. Coal is basically fossilized peat. We get a fair amount of interest from petrologists and from geologists that study, coal formations, fossil fuels, that kind of thing, because in studying how the system has formed, and it gives people an idea of, where to look for additional coal deposits.
Let me show you what they mean by black water. All of the rotting vegetation in the swamp creates tannic acid, And it actually turns the water kind of a dark brown. Think of it like a cup of tea.
This is one of the largest intact freshwater ecosystems in the world. It is designated a wetland of international importance by the United Nations. There is so much beauty. The Spanish moss makes the scenes almost surreal. It isn't really moss at all. It's more like an air plant and uses tiny cup-shaped scales to collect moisture and nutrients from the air. It gives the swamp a sort of haunted look. In other areas of the swamp, cypress trees dominate the scenery. The roots are hidden, so you just see this wide base emerge from the water and get thinner as it reaches for the sky. The wood is rot-resistant, which allows the trees to survive in this environment. And you often see pointed knobs that stick up around the base. They're called knees, and scientists think they might supply oxygen to the root of a tree. But no one is really sure. It's all part of the mystique that brings visitors from every state in the nation and every country in the world. The head of Georgia's Department of Natural Resources kayaks the swamp with family and friends. Chris Clark says this is a great escape from the world of Blackberries, iPods, computers, and TV.
You're talking about an area larger than Metro Atlanta that's out here for people to paddle, that is unspoiled, that you can fish. I mean, there's almost 400 different species of animals out here, from different types of amphibians to fish to mammals. And so, I mean, really in one location you have just an incredible biodiversity. I think Georgians, sometimes we get to go so fast that we forget the canyons that we have, we forget the incredible swamps that we have, the coast of Georgia. I mean, we have more on the coast of Georgia. We have the majority of all the saltwater marsh anywhere in the eastern seaboard, right here in Georgia. We've got more undeveloped islands on this coast than anywhere else in the whole United States. And so people just, I think sometimes we just get to go so fast we forget about that.
There have been times in our history when the swamp wasn't appreciated for its wildness. As railroads reached the outskirts of the swamp, investors saw the potential of harvesting all these trees. In 1889, the Georgia legislature authorized the sale of 0kefenokee, and it was purchased 2 years later by the Suwannee Canal Company. The idea was to drain the swamp and harvest the cypress trees. But the effort failed. Remnants of the canal remain at the east entrance to the swamp, where Chip, Campbell, and Joy operate their tour business. Chip took us to the middle of the swamp, where new owners of 0kefenokee were more successful. Hebbard Cypress Company built a railroad across the swamp and pulled the logs out by train. Here on Billy's Island, there are still remnants of the rugged machines that cleared the cypress and reminders of the elaborate rail system that cut through 0kefenokee.
There were miles of it. There was a main line, and then there were these side spurs off of it, and they would extend those side spurs out into a timber stand. They would cut the timber, snake it out, and then they would actually pull the rail off those little side spurs and reuse it as they went along.
From 1910 until the late 1920s, it worked. The sawmill was in Waycross, near the north entrance to the swamp. Other companies also harvested cypress and pine. Here on Billy's Island, an entire community built up around logging.
There was a full-blown town. There were 600 people lived on this island, and the train kind of ran through the middle of it all and branched off, but there were homes, there was a movie house, there were stores. You know, it was a full-blown town.
But long before the logging operations, there were families living on Billy's Island. They were isolated, but they could get everything they needed from the swamp.
What do they call them? Swamp people?
We call them swampers.
Swampers.
Yeah, swampers. They called themselves swampers, and there were mostly Scots and Scots-Irish descent people. A lot of them came out of the Carolinas, came down to this part of the country, and of course on down into Florida. But by and large, they lived a pretty self-sufficient lifestyle in here. They could produce a whole lot of what they needed right in the homestead, and they took from the swamp things like, raccoon and otter hides, alligator hides. Some of them would grow some sugar cane and make that into cane syrup.
So I'm just thinking, if I were inclined to build a moonshine still, I'm just saying that it would be a perfect location.
Yeah, well, there was a bit of that took place here. Yeah,
like all over Okefenokee.
All around. Yeah, all the polite company, they don't necessarily like to talk a lot about that, but yeah, it's pretty well known. There was a fair amount of moonshining that went on. And even when the town was here, of course, it was prohibition when the town was here. In some cases, they built on rafts, and if the revenuers got a little too close, they just came out and poled the rafts away. Yeah, moved the still somewhere else.
There's always a way.
There's
right?
always people are very resourceful. Always.
The swampers raised livestock, grew crops, and killed any alligators or bears that got in the way. There was a great deal of respect for the settlers who lived here, but their way of life was chipped away bit by bit as more people discovered the resources they had lived on for years and began to introduce the modern world to a culture that had been left behind.
This is a tough landscape to cross on foot. It amazes me no end that long before we had GPS and an aerial reconnaissance, these swampers had found most all of these islands out here, just walking around exploring, hunting, fishing, trapping.
As researchers studied this ecology, they began to realize its uniqueness and started a campaign to protect it. In 1937, President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order establishing the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. The swamp is now protected by law, but nature can sometimes have a plan of its own. Fire continues to alter Okefenokee, and that's one thing even a presidential order cannot stop.
And then in 2007 had an extreme drought, and a fire that started on the north end of the refuge got onto the refuge and created another fire from a lightning storm that developed over the refuge. Wound up burning about 565,000 acres total.
From our perspective, it's probably the worst fire we've ever been on.
The fires hurt a lot of businesses, but for the Okefenokee, it was a natural and perhaps necessary way to keep the swamp a swamp. Without fires from time to time, the islands would grow larger and the waterways would close in.
But when it came into the refuge, it really set back the successional patterns that we had here. And to me, that's the best thing that has occurred since I've been here, is for that fire to actually come through and knock back a lot of this woody vegetation that had been encroaching for the first 20-some years that I had been here.
The swamp is constantly changing. Only the regulars can keep up with the shifting waterways and moving land. But that's part of what people come for, a sense of uncertainty and always a large dose of nature. As you travel these liquid trails, you meet others who have come for the same sights and sounds.
This is actually about my 5th trip.
Yeah.
What brings you back?
I love being out here where it's just quiet, get away from everything.
Peaceful.
Yeah.
It's real peaceful.
If you are looking for peace and tranquility, this is your spot. Naturalists are in heaven here. Raccoons sneak around the bushes. On occasion, a black bear will show itself. We headed west for the Suwannee River, made famous by Stephen Foster's 1851 song. This is a beautiful part of Georgia that's off the beaten path. Many people access the river through Stephen Foster State Park near Fargo. It serves as the west entrance to 0kefenokee. Quiet by evening, the park is bustling most mornings with a steady stream of tourists, fishermen, and kayakers heading out for a swamp experience. 0kefenokee has been the setting for many movies and the subject of dozens of documentaries, including this one produced in 1991 by GPB.
This is the most fascinating and peaceful place in the world to me. It's rich in wildlife, history, and infinite beauty. The great 0kefenokee Swamp, the land of the trembling earth. My name is 0kefenokee Joe. This swamp was once my home. I lived here. I learned here. This is where I became swamp wise. I left the city a long time ago for reasons I don't need to disclose. Now I won't make excuses for the way I appear or this laid-back life I have chose. I don't bother nobody, I just like living free, free as the wind and the trees. In the 0kefenokee I can be as I please. The swamp is home to me, and I'm swamp wise. Swamp wise.
There is an irony that this wilderness so many companies tried to develop could actually be a great selling point to bring in new jobs and industries for other parts of the state.
Almost you have to see it through somebody else's eyes sometime, but when we went to somewhere like China, the first thing they did is they take us to the Great Wall, or they take us to the Chinese Pyramid, or they take us to the desert. When you go to Europe, they want to take you to the lake area. They realize they are maybe better than we do, that's the image in your mind. And so what I've talked a lot about to economic developers in the state is, this is what you sell. When we go all over the world now, we talk about the beaches and the rivers. We talk about the mountains. You know, industrial parks you can find anywhere. But it's the workforce and the people, and it's the natural places that you have that make the difference. And so I think it's a defining game changer. And so I think we have to think about, instead of just taking a helicopter and showing people industrial parks, if we show them something like this, they're going to remember this over every other state out there or every other country.
It is quite rightly considered, you know, to be the largest, finest example of the type. It's also one of the best protected. And so, in effect, it serves as an ambassador for this kind of wetland and wetlands in general to a lot of people. I mean, the refuge, the 0kefenokee National Wildlife Refuge here, is really considered a flagship refuge of our National Wildlife Refuge system in the eastern United States.
I never tire of seeing an alligator, seeing an egret or a sandhill crane, or hearing something. I never tire of it. And I can't imagine ever, oh, it's just another sandhill. I can't imagine, if that ever happened, it's time to move on. But I can't imagine ever getting to the point where it just doesn't matter anymore. It just doesn't excite me anymore, because it's what I love. It's what we love. It's what our life is pretty much all about these days.
I tell people everywhere that I talk to that this is my concept of God's garden. This is where I believe that Adam and Eve, something like this, probably was the place that they were in, you know, when the Bible was talking about them. So that kind of sets the stage for me. You know, it's truly a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Few would argue that the swamp is a Georgia treasure. It is also a science wonderland with potential for new discoveries behind every tree. Before General Charles Floyd claimed this land for Georgia, he wrote, "The 0kefenokee is one of the wonders of the world. It is a complete labyrinth, and many of its recesses are yet to be explored." That was more than a century ago, yet despite all the efforts to tame this swamp, those words still ring true.
0kefenokee is constantly changing. It is a living, breathing organism that cannot be controlled. Thanks to the law passed in 1937, it will remain that way. I'm Sharon Collins. We'll see you next time.
Information about this show, check out our website at gpb.org/Georgia Outdoors.
Funding for Georgia Outdoors has been made possible in part by a grant from the Imlay Foundation.